Part 1. The Cafeteria. The cafeteria at Forward Operating Base Ironwood had a particular quality of silence that sat heavy on your shoulders like a wet wool blanket. It wasn't quiet, not exactly. There was the industrial drone of refrigeration units, working overtime against the Afghan heat, the scrape and clatter of trays, the low murmur of 100 separate conversations happening in isolated pockets across the space. But underneath all that noise was a stillness, a collective holding of breath, everyone keeping their real thoughts locked down tight behind their teeth. Senior Chief Petty Officer Maya Chen sat alone at a corner table, her attention fixed on the ruggedized tablet propped against her water bottle. Her fork moved in an absent-minded rhythm, scoop, chew, swallow, while her eyes tracked lines of encrypted data scrolling across the screen. She was troubleshooting a signal integrity problem in the base's new communication array that had been driving the tech staff insane for a week. She was small, 5'5" in boots, with dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun and the kind of unremarkable features that made people's eyes slide right past her. 34 years old, with fine lines just beginning to etch themselves around her eyes from too many hours staring at screens in too many classified facilities. She liked being unremarkable. Invisibility was a tactical advantage she'd learned to leverage years ago. The stillness shattered when 3 shadows fell across her table like a storm front rolling in. Marine Force reconnaissance. You could tell by the swagger, that particular brand of arrogance that came from knowing you were part of an elite unit, from having passed one of the toughest selection courses in the military. Gunnery Sergeant Wade Cortez led the pack. 6'3", 240, built like a concrete piling with a neck that disappeared into his shoulders. His smile was all performance, teeth and no warmth. Behind him came Corporal Jackson Hayes, wiry and nervous, always looking for validation. And Corporal Danny Reeves, whose call sign Mouth was the kind of ironic nickname that was actually just accurate. Well, Cortez announced, his voice pitched to carry across the nearby tables. He leaned over her table, his knuckles brushing the metal surface. Look what we got here, boys. The Navy's latest science experiment. Chen's fork paused for half a second, then continued its journey to her mouth. She chewed, swallowed, her eyes never left the screen. I heard she's got, super secret clearance, Hayes said, playing his part in the performance. All that top secret spy shit. Probably hacks into Russian satellites or whatever. Hacks into satellites, Cortez repeated, savoring the words like they were a punchline. That's what we need in a combat zone, right? Someone who can type really fast and knows how to reboot a router. Forget marksmanship. Forget physical fitness. Can you configure a firewall? You're in. Reeves laughed, a sharp, ugly sound that didn't quite reach his eyes. Bet she'd have an asthma attack if she had to run the PT course. Probably needs one of those inhalers just to walk up a flight of stairs. Chen's expression didn't change. She reached for her water bottle, took a measured sip, and set it back down with precision. Her finger scrolled to the next section of encrypted code. The lack of reaction was gasoline on Cortez's ego. Hey, he nudged her tray with the back of his hand. The plastic cup of water wobbled dangerously. I'm talking to you, Senior Chief. Word is you came from some special program. That true? You some kind of cyber ninja? Chen finally raised her eyes. Not to look at Cortez, that would be giving him what he wanted, but to a point just past his shoulder, like she was calculating the trajectory of something more interesting in the middle distance. Is there something I can help you with, Gunnery Sergeant? Her voice was soft, neutral, completely devoid of challenge or fear. It was the worst possible response. Cortez's face flushed dark. Yeah, there's something you can help me with. You can help me understand what the hell the Navy's thinking, sending a glorified IT tech to an operational base. You know what we used to call people like you? Poes. Remfs. The people who hide behind desks while we do the actual bleeding. He straightened up, playing to his growing audience. Several nearby tables have gone quiet, soldiers watching the confrontation with the guilty fascination of motorists passing a car wreck. I mean, look at you. He gestured vaguely at her with disdain. 5 feet of nothing. Probably never qualified expert on anything except Microsoft Excel. And they give you a clearance higher than mine? Give you access to our operational systems? It's a joke. The whole thing's a goddamn diversity hire joke. Hayes, emboldened by his leader's performance, chimed in. It's that quota bullshit, Gunny. Gotta check the boxes. Doesn't matter if you're actually qualified. Just matters what kind of plumbing you've got. Exactly, Cortez boomed, pointing a thick finger at Chen's still averted head. This is the problem with the modern military. This right here. They think a line of code is worth more than a magazine full of rounds. They think a strong Wi-Fi signal is more important than a strong warrior. He paused for effect, his gaze sweeping across the now silent room. You ask me? These specialty cyber programs are worthless. Absolutely worthless. And the people in them? He looked directly at Chen. Worth nothing. With a final, deliberate act of contempt, he backhanded her tray. It skittered across the table with a metallic screech. The lukewarm stew, some kind of meat product the mess hall optimistically called beef, sloshed over the edges. Green beans scattered like shrapnel. The plastic cup tipped, water spreading in a growing pool that reached the edge of her tablet before dripping onto the floor. The room held its breath. Chen did not flinch. For exactly 3 seconds, she counted them, an old habit from training where timing was everything. She remained perfectly still. Then, with movements so economical they were almost unnerving, she powered down her tablet, slipped it into its waterproof case, and stood. She picked up the soiled tray, walked it to the disposal window, and scraped the contents into the bin. She placed the tray on the rack. She turned and walked toward the exit, her footsteps measured and even, leaving behind a wake of stunned silence and the sour smell of spilled institutional food. She never looked back. Not at Cortez, whose smirk was already starting to curdle into something like uncertainty. Not at the dozens of faces tracking her movement across the room. Not at the army ranger sitting 2 tables over who whispered to his companion, "That was either the smartest thing I've ever seen or the dumbest. Can't decide which." Part 2. Documentation. Chen's quarters were a windowless 8x10 box in the secure barracks, the kind of space afforded to personnel with TS/SCI clearances and a need to work on classified material in private. A rack, a desk bolted to the wall, a chair, a footlocker. A single photograph on the desk. 5 people in desert camouflage, faces obscured by tactical wraps and night vision goggles, standing in front of a helicopter that officially didn't exist. She sat at the desk and booted up her workstation. The screen cast a pale blue glow across her face as she navigated through 3 levels of encryption to a secure partition. She opened a new incident log. Cursor blinked, a patient green metronome marking time. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. Incident log. 2040Z&Z, 18 September. Location. DFAC FOB Ironwood. Personnel. GYS-GT Wade Cortez USMC. CPL Jackson Hayes USMC. CPL Danny Reeves USMC. She typed with clinical detachment, transcribing their words as if they were data points in a flawed algorithm. Subject. Cortez initiated verbal confrontation. Topic. Perceived lack of qualifications based on gender and military occupational specialty. Direct quote. Worth nothing. Physical action. Subject Cortez intentionally displaced meal tray, causing spillage and potential damage to classified equipment. Ruggedized tablet, serial hashtag TBD47-9982. She paused, her mind replaying the event with perfect clarity. The angle of his arm, the velocity of impact, the trajectory of the water as it arcs toward her tablet. Physics. Cause and effect. All just data. Next, she accessed the base security network with her root-level credentials, a fact that would have made Cortez's head explode if he'd known about it. She pulled up the DFAC camera feeds, isolated camera 8, and scrubbed to the timestamp of the incident. There it was. A silent, grainy film of Cortez's arrogance and her own deliberate non-response. She bookmarked the clip and created 3 redundant encrypted backups on separate servers in separate physical locations. DFAC_18SEP_2047Z Campo08_EVID01.mp4. She attached the file to her log entry. Documentation. Chain of custody. Evidence before escalation. The rules weren't just bureaucratic obstacles. They were weapons, if you knew how to use them. She closed the file. The task was complete. Her emotional state remained flat. The insult was irrelevant. The disrespect was a symptom of a systemic flaw. Cortez and his crew were bugs in the code, variables producing undesirable outputs. The system required correction. With the report filed in her private archives, she stood and began to methodically strip out of her uniform. The noise, the arrogance, the public humiliation, it was all static. White noise obscuring the signal. She needed to recalibrate. Return to a place where only physics mattered. Part 3. The Deep. The combat dive training facility at FOB Ironwood was a concrete tomb, 20 feet deep, filled with chlorinated water that smelled like chemicals and cold silence. The only light came from dim red safety lamps spaced along the walls, casting everything in a hellish crimson glow. Chen moved through the empty locker room like she was performing a sacred ritual. She laid out her gear on a bench with geometric precision. A low-profile rebreather, a frameless mask, split fins, a weight belt. Each piece was checked and double-checked. The hiss of the oxygen valve as she cracked it was a familiar whisper, almost a greeting. This was her sanctuary. The place where the chaotic variables of the surface world were nullified by the immutable laws of pressure and buoyancy. She slipped into the water without a splash, just a seamless transition from one element to another. With a few powerful, efficient kicks, she descended to the bottom of the tank and settled cross-legged on the tiled floor. The world contracted to the rhythmic bubble of her rebreather, the soft green glow of her dive computer, and the distorted red light filtering down through 20 feet of water. Here there were no egos, no politics, no need to prove anything to anyone, just pressure, time, and the precise management of gases. She closed her eyes. Her mind, freed from external static, began to work in the way it worked best, visualizing problems, mapping solutions, running simulations at a speed that would make most people's brains hurt. She didn't replay Cortez's insults. That would be inefficient, a waste of cognitive resources. Instead, she visualized vectors, force distribution, the physics of a three-body problem in a confined space. She traced theoretical lines of force from a shove, mapped the arc of a lunging arm, calculated pivot points and leverage ratios. She saw the brachial plexus, the radial nerve, the delicate architecture of joints and tendons, not as targets for violence, but as inputs for a control system. It was meditation, recalibration, mathematical preparation. The world above was loud, emotional, driven by ego and misperception. Here, in the crushing silence of the deep, only physics was true. A body in motion stayed in motion, unless acted upon by an external force. A joint could only bend so far before ligaments tore. Leverage trumped strength, always. For 60 minutes, she remained on the bottom, a silent statue in the red gloom, her oxygen consumption so minimal it would have made a competitive freediver jealous. She wasn't nursing a grudge. She was preparing for a statistical probability. The data from the first incident suggested a high likelihood of escalation. Cortez's psychological profile, his need for dominance, his inability to process being ignored, indicated he would interpret her silence as weakness or disrespect. He would provoke again. The system would require further correction. When she finally surfaced, the air felt thin and sharp in her lungs. She emerged from the pool, water streaming from her body, and began the methodical process of breaking down her gear. The world of noise and friction awaited above, but she was ready for it now. Centered, calm, prepared to debug the system. Part 4, the corridor. 2 days passed in a quiet hum of productivity. Chen integrated the new frequency-hopping spread-spectrum protocols into the base's electronic warfare suite. Her work was elegant, seamless, the kind of competence that was invisible until something broke and people realized how much they'd been depending on it. She spoke only when necessary. Her reports were clipped and precise. Her interactions with colleagues were professional and minimal. To the casual observer, she was exactly what Cortez had accused her of being, a quiet technician, more comfortable with machines than people, content to let others take credit while she did the unglamorous work. The whispers about the DFAC incident had faded into background noise, replaced by newer gossip about a supply sergeant caught running a black market in energy drinks and contraband tobacco. The second provocation came exactly when her analysis predicted it would, and in precisely the environment her threat assessment had identified as most probable. The maintenance corridor connecting the Secure Operations Center to the barracks was a narrow, utilitarian tube of exposed conduit and metal grating.
It ran for nearly 100 yards through the guts of the facility, lined with electrical junction boxes, cable runs, and occasional recessed doorways leading to utility spaces. The security cameras here were older models. She'd noted the blind spots during her initial base security assessment. It was a place for shortcuts between buildings, for quiet conversations, and occasionally for less official business. Chen was returning from a late shift, her tablet bag slung over one shoulder, her mind still half occupied with the signal latency problem she'd been working on. There was an anomalous spike in the tertiary satellite link that didn't make sense. She became aware of the three figures before she saw them. The air pressure changed slightly, three large bodies displacing atmosphere in a confined space. The ambient noise shifted. Her subconscious threat assessment system, honed by years of training, flagged the anomaly before her conscious mind caught up. Cortez, Hayes, and Reeves emerged from a recessed doorway about 30 feet ahead, blocking the corridor. They'd been waiting. Cortez had a smile on his face that was ugly and confident. The sodium lamp overhead cast harsh shadows that turned his features into something carved from stone. "Well, well," he said, his voice a low rumble that didn't echo in the sound-dampening space. "Look who's burning the midnight oil. Trying to impress the brass with how many spreadsheets you can fill out?" Chen stopped approximately 8 feet away. Her posture remained relaxed, her hands visible and empty at her sides. She said nothing. Her eyes scanned the environment with the same methodical precision she brought to debugging code. Distance to each man, width of corridor, concrete walls offering no give, electrical junction box to her left, fire extinguisher mounted to her right, conduit runs overhead. Data points, variables, a three-dimensional problem space. "Cat got your tongue, Senior Chief?" Hayes taunted, stepping forward to crowd her space. "Or are you just scared? We heard you didn't even file a complaint about the other day. Smart. Shows you know your place in the food chain." "Probably doesn't even know how to file a complaint," Reeves added, his voice thin and nervous. He was the weak link, Chen noted, the follower who was only brave in a pack. Probably just went back to her room and cried into her pillow like a little... "We just want to have a conversation," Cortez interrupted, taking another step closer, his bulk filling the narrow hallway. He was close enough now that Chen could smell the dip tobacco in his breath and see the slight dilation of his pupils. "Make sure there's no misunderstanding about your place here. See, me and my boys, we're operators. We're the tip of the spear. We go downrange and do the work." He gestured dismissively at her. You're the person who sharpens the spear. Important job, I guess. Administrative support. But let's not get confused about who actually wields it." Chen's gaze remained steady, her expression unreadable. This was the escalation: verbal harassment, physical intimidation, isolation from witnesses. All variables she'd accounted for in her threat model. She subtly shifted her weight to the balls of her feet. Her right hand, hanging loosely at her side, made a minute, almost invisible gesture, activating the body camera clipped to her belt beneath her jacket. The indicator understanding of physics had just been fundamentally revised. The corridor was suddenly vast and silent, filled only with their heavy breathing and the distant hum of ventilation. Chen looked at Cortez, her gaze finally meeting his directly. It was a calm, analytical look, devoid of anger or triumph. "The conversation," she said quietly, her voice carrying absolute finality despite its softness, "is concluded." She turned and walked away, her footsteps once again even and measured, echoing down the now unobstructed corridor. This time, there was no question of them following. They were left behind, tangled in their own aggression, defeated not by brute force, but by a quiet competence they couldn't begin to comprehend. Part 5. Aftermath. The immediate aftermath was a study in cognitive dissonance. 3 Marine Force recon operators, men who could hike 50 miles with 100-pound packs, who regularly scored expert on every weapons qualification, who'd completed some of the hardest training in the military, stood in a maintenance corridor like broken automatons. The sharp, searing pain in Cortez's wrist was almost secondary to the profound, ego-shattering shock. He'd pushed her. He remembered pushing her. The feeling of his hand on her small shoulder. And then, a blur of motion, a wrenching sensation in his wrist, and the floor rushing up to meet his face. It was like being caught in a machine. No rage, no emotion, just cold, terrifying efficiency. "What the hell was that?" Reeves finally gasped, still trying to will his arm to respond. The sensation was returning now, painful pins and needles, like the limb had been asleep for hours. Cortez didn't answer. He was cradling his wrist, his face a storm of fury and humiliation. His mind replayed the engagement over and over, trying to find the moment where it had gone wrong. He'd had every advantage: size, strength, numbers, surprise. And somehow, in less time than it took to breathe, she'd turned all of it against him. "She hit me," Reeves said, his voice small. "But it didn't... it wasn't like getting hit. It was like she flipped a switch and my arm just stopped." Hayes just stared down the empty corridor, his brain struggling to replay an event that seemed to defy the laws of physics as he understood them. Word began to spread, not as a clear report, but as a series of fragmented, unbelievable rumors. It started with a maintenance tech who'd been in an adjacent utility space and heard the commotion. He'd cracked the door just in time to see 3 Force Recon Marines looking utterly defeated, and the small Navy chief walking away, serene as a Sunday morning. By breakfast, it had reached the barracks, where Reeves and Hayes gave vague, blustering accounts of her getting lucky or using some kind of cheap shot. But their lack of detail and visible unease told a different story. The narrative on the base began to shift. The quiet, nerdy Navy chief was now a figure of mystery. The mockery that had followed Chen since her arrival curdled into something else: confused, wary respect. People gave her wider berth in the hallways. Conversations would dip in volume when she entered a room. They were no longer looking at a data clerk. They were looking at an unknown quantity. And in their world, unknowns were dangerous. Chen, for her part, proceeded as if absolutely nothing had happened. She went directly from the corridor to her workstation in the silent, glowing heart of the operations center. She sat down, took a single, centering breath, and began the next phase of the protocol. She opened a new formal incident report. The template was standard DoD format, used for everything from equipment failures to personnel disputes. Her entry was clinical, devoid of emotional content. Subject: report of unprofessional conduct and physical assault. Submitting officer: CCPO Maya Chen, USN. Personnel involved: GY Sergeant Wade Cortez, USMC. Corporal Jackson Hayes, USMC. Corporal Danny Reeves, USMC. Narrative: at approximately 0127Z, 20 September, in Maintenance Corridor 3 Delta, undersigned was confronted and verbally harassed by subjects listed above. Subject Cortez initiated unprovoked physical contact, shove to shoulder. In response, undersigned employed minimal non-injurious control techniques to create distance and de-escalate situation. Incident represents continuation of harassment pattern initiated 18 September. Ref: DFAC _18 SEP _2047Z CAM 08 EVID 01. She paused, then created a new attachment. The video file from her body camera was crystal clear, the audio sharp. Every sneer, every taunt, every movement captured in perfect fidelity. She named the file: Corridor 20 SEP 0127Z _H skulls _01.mp4. She addressed the report to Commander Patricia Cross, her immediate superior. She carbon copied the Provost Marshal's office and the Staff Judge Advocate. She clicked send. The report vanished into the secure network with a soft chime. She had used their system to correct their behavior. She had trusted the rules. Now the institutional machinery would begin to turn. Correction was in progress. Part 6. The Hearing. The hearing was convened in a wood-paneled conference room that smelled of floor polish and institutional gravity. A long polished table dominated the space, its surface reflecting the overhead fluorescence like dark water. At the head sat Colonel Marcus Thane, the brigade commander, a man whose face looked like it had been carved from old boot leather by someone who was really angry at leather. Flanking him were Command Sergeant Major Patricia Orozco and Captain Benjamin Yu from the JAG Corps. On one side of the table sat Cortez, Hayes, and Reeves, their uniforms immaculate, their expressions carefully arranged into masks of wounded dignity and righteous confusion. They had their story straight. She was unstable, a woman having some kind of breakdown. They'd been concerned NCOs trying to help, and she'd attacked them without warning. It was a classic he said, she said. And they were 3 decorated Marines with deployment patches and combat action badges. On the other side sat Senior Chief Chen and Commander Cross. Chen was a portrait of calm, her hands resting lightly on the table, her expression neutral as she looked directly at Colonel Thane. The colonel opened the folder in front of him. Gunnery Sergeant Cortez, he began, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. You and your men stand accused of assault, making false official statements, and conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. How do you respond? Cortez sat bolt upright, every inch the professional Marine. Sir, with all due respect, the accusations are completely false. We have nothing but respect for Senior Chief Chen and her service to our nation. His tone was earnest, his face appropriately serious. What happened was a misunderstanding. In the dining facility, some inter-service banter got out of hand. We take full responsibility for that. But in the corridor, sir, we were genuinely concerned for the Senior Chief's welfare. She seemed agitated, unstable. When I reached out to help, to make sure she was okay, she attacked us, sir, without warning. Hayes and Reeves nodded in solemn agreement, adding corroborating details that were as false as fool's gold. She put Reeves's arm out of commission and injured my wrist, sir, Cortez continued. We were forced to defend ourselves. I think the Senior Chief may be suffering from some kind of stress-related issue that requires evaluation.
Captain Yu made notes, his pen scratching softly. His expression was professionally impassive. Colonel Thane's eyes narrowed slightly.
He turned to Chen. Senior Chief, your response? Chen's voice was clear and level. My response is detailed in my written report, sir. I have nothing to add at this time. Commander Cross spoke up. Colonel, with your permission, Senior Chief Chen's report contains corroborating evidence that clarifies the sequence of events. The colonel nodded to Captain Yu, who tapped commands into a laptop connected to a wall-mounted monitor. The screen flickered to life. The first video was the grainy footage from the DFAC. The room watched in silence as Cortez and his crew surrounded Chen's table. The aggressive body language, the mocking gestures, the backhand that sent her tray flying. The atmosphere shifted, became heavier, colder. Cortez's face tightened, a flicker of unease in his eyes. That was, sir, it got out of hand, but it was just, you'll speak when spoken to, Gunnery Sergeant, Colonel Thane said quietly. His voice had dropped about 20 degrees. Captain Yu played the second video. Body camera footage. Crystal clear audio. Well, look who's working late. Chat Cat got your tongue, Senior Chief? We're the tip of the spear. You're the person who sharpens the spear. They watched the shove. Then they watched the pivot. Captain Yu slowed the footage to quarter speed. The room watched, mesmerized, as flawless, impossible physics unfolded on the screen. The wrist lock. The nerve strike so fast it was almost subliminal. The controlled redirection. 3 highly trained Marines neutralized in under 10 seconds, without a single punch thrown. They heard Chen's final words. The conversation is concluded. The video ended. The screen went dark. The silence was absolute. Dense, suffocating, filled with the death of a carefully constructed lie. Cortez, Hayes, and Reeves sat frozen, their faces ashen. The smug confidence had evaporated, replaced by the stark, cold terror of being caught in an undeniable truth. Colonel Thane slowly sat back in his chair. He looked at the 3 Marines, and his expression was not rage, but profound disappointment, the kind that cuts deeper than anger ever could. I've seen a lot in my career, he said quietly. I've seen cowards. I've seen bullies. I've seen men who wore the uniform but dishonored everything it stands for. He paused. But I have rarely seen anything as pathetic as what I just watched. He turned to Chen. His eyes, which had been hard and skeptical at the start, now held something different. Respect. The real kind. Earned and absolute. Senior Chief Chen, thank you for your restraint. Thank you for your professionalism. And thank you for trusting the system to work. He turned back to Cortez, and the temperature in the room dropped another 10 degrees. Gunnery Sergeant Cortez, you and your men are a disgrace. Not just to your unit, but to the uniform of the United States Marine Corps. He detailed the findings. Guilty on all charges. Reduction in rank. Forfeiture of pay. Reassignment to non-leadership positions. Letters of reprimand in their permanent files. Their careers were effectively over. Part 7. The Formation. The next morning, the sun rose over FOB Ironwood. casting long, sharp shadows across the main parade ground.
By 0630, the entire base command was assembled, nearly 1,000 personnel standing at rigid attention in the pre-dawn chill. There was tension in the formation, a buzz of anticipation. Everyone knew something significant was happening.
Colonel Thane stood at the podium, his voice amplified across the base. "This morning," he began, his words landing like hammer blows, "we address a failure.
A failure of discipline, character, and leadership." He recounted the incidents, not in detail, but in broad, damning strokes. He spoke of arrogance, bullying, and the poison of underestimating a fellow warrior based on gender or specialty.
"Honor, courage, and commitment are not just words we stencil on walls," he declared. "They are standards we uphold. 3 Marines under my command failed to meet those standards.
They brought dishonor upon themselves and their unit." He called Cortez, Hayes, and Reeves to the front. They marched forward, their faces grim, unable to meet the gaze of 1,000 pairs of eyes. Then he did something unexpected. Senior Chief Petty Officer Chen, front and center. Chen emerged from her formation, her stride calm and measured. She rendered a crisp salute. The colonel returned it. Senior Chief Chen demonstrated the highest ideals of military service, he told the formation. When confronted with aggression, she responded with discipline. She trusted the system and provided irrefutable proof. She has taught us what true strength looks like. He turned to Cortez, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous command that carried across the entire parade ground. "Private Cortez, render a salute to Senior Chief Chen." For a moment, Cortez hesitated, his body rigid with humiliation. Then, under the crushing weight of the colonel's stare and the silent judgment of 1,000 peers, he complied. He raised his hand in a salute that was mechanically perfect but spiritually broken. It was the salute of a man forced to acknowledge a truth that shattered his worldview. That the person he'd mocked and attacked was in every way that mattered, his superior. Chen met his gaze for one brief second. Then she returned the salute, her movements precise, devoid of triumph. It was not a victory. It was a restoration of order. Part 8. Return to signal. The final scene played out in the operations center. The atmosphere had changed. The whispers were gone, replaced by respectful distance. Chen sat at her terminal, analyzing signal propagation patterns from a drone swarm. Commander Cross approached, watching the data flow. "Got a call from Cybercom this morning," Cross said quietly. "They want you for a new program. Ghost Protocol. Your choice." Chen's fingers continued typing. "I'll think about it." "That was well done, by the way." "All of it. I followed procedure," Chen replied, "that's all. Most people would have handled it differently, violently, emotionally." Chen finally looked up. "Discipline is all we have, ma'am. Without it, we're just violence in uniform." Cross smiled. "I'm using that in my next leadership talk." As Cross walked away, Chen's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown Virginian number. "Heard about Ironwood. Impressive work. Coffee when stateside? R." She knew who R was. Captain Rachel Torres, running selection for a program that didn't officially exist. Chen typed, "Copy. Will advise ETA." She put the phone away and returned to her screens. The past was a closed file. The system had worked. The malfunction had been corrected. Now there was new work. Always new work. She pulled up the latest problem. A communications gap in denied territory that had stumped 3 contractors and cost millions. Her fingers began to move, diving into the data, finding the signal hidden in the noise. Outside, the base continued its rhythm. The mission continued. And in the quiet heart of the operations center, Senior Chief Maya Chen did what she'd been doing for 15 years. She found the problems no one else could see. She solved them with precision, and she moved on. Quiet as ever, unassuming as ever. But now, everyone knew. The quiet ones were often the most dangerous, and the most capable. Epilogue. 6 months later. Private Wade Cortez stood in a supply warehouse at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, counting ammunition crates in the humid Carolina heat. It was his 10th week of inventory duty. His hands were blistered, his back ached. His pride was shattered beyond repair. Every morning he woke up and remembered that video playing in the conference room. The moment his entire world collapsed. He'd underestimated her, dismissed her, attacked her, and she corrected him with surgical precision. He would never make rank again. His career was over. He was just serving out his time. But the lesson would stay with him forever. Never mistake quiet for weak. Never mistake calm for incapable. And never underestimate someone just because they don't fit your expectations. Meanwhile, in a secure facility in Northern Virginia, Senior Chief Maya Chen sat in a classified briefing room with 7 other operators, specialists handpicked from across the intelligence and special operations community. Captain Rachel Torres stood at the front, displaying a map of denied territory across multiple theaters. "This is Ghost Protocol," Torres said. "Zero fail missions. Deep penetration, technical exploitation, exfil under extreme pressure. The kind that doesn't exist and never happened." She looked at Chen. "Maya, you'll run signals intelligence and cyber operations. Questions?" Chen studied the map, her mind already processing angles, calculating risks, identifying elegant solutions hidden in complexity. "No questions," she said quietly. "I'm ready." Because she always was. The mission continued.